documents, the treaties, the charters, is actually significant. The dates of coming into effect is significant in the sense that you want to know the time period or the environment in which this IO was created, or during which it underwent changes, right? So that means tweaks to the treaties, like what you see, say with the EU, right? All the different time periods that you had, the different treaties like Lisbon Treaty, Maastricht Treaty, and so on. Okay, in some of these cases, the time period is very significant. Why? Because it signals changes in it signals changes in the international environment, right? And it signals changes that are occurring as a result of changes in in international environment, changes that impact on the way states react to each other. Say, like for example, League of Nations, right? It signaled changes relating to how great powers were considering that it was now important to shift away from secret diplomacy and understood the need for things like disarmament, right? So that is why the dates of coming into effect are also important. It's not just, it's not just an embellishment or, like a show off of knowledge that you put in that it makes your answer look good. It's really, about uh, sometimes how relevant it is. The treaties, as instrumental, are also important. Why? Because it outlines to you, number one, uh, what were the motivations for creating the IO. Number two, it also outlines the logic of um, what are the resistance, right, in formulating or creating the IO. Like, say, for example, it's very clear when you look at, say, OAU and AU, right? What is it that states basically were concerned about? Sovereignty, right? So, as a result of this, do you see you would see particular clauses that are inbuilt, right, into the founding documents that protect interests of the states, and it's a reflection of the organizing principle within that particular international society, right, or within the international political system. Okay, so that is why the treaties are basically instrumental. It highlights also, what not only what is the international order, but it also highlights the extent, right, that states basically can function, right? Can you hold on 1 second? Hold on 1 second. I need to go to the washroom. Hold on. Sorry. I needed to go and clear my throat. Sorry. All right. Now I was choking a little bit before I have a coughing fit, right? That's why I decided to get out of the room first. Okay, never mind. Yeah, I'm fine. Don't worry. Sorry. No, I mean, it's creating a delay, but yeah. Anyway, so like what I was saying, sorry. I'm sorry. Where did I stop? What was the last thing I said? Sorry, can somebody just help me out here? I mentioned about the treaties being fundamental and the state interest, right? Was that where I stopped? Yeah. Okay. What extent states can hold on to, um or states, what to what extent states can use the charter to map out their interests. Yeah, that's basically the idea here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Then basically, so you look, and then what you also want to look at the mandate and the treaties, right? Is you want to basically be able to explain the logic about the mandate and the treaties being significant in the sense that we use that as a gauge to understand whether we think that the IO is too lofty in its ideals. Is it overly ambitious, right? So, and then we use that as a gauge to then indicate why do we think the IO has failed, right? So you say, for example, when you look at a lot of these IOs, they do a lot of things that is beyond their scope. They do things that states do not want to do or cannot do, and then they get criticized because they spend the money, or they get criticized because they take a long time to get action, to conclude action. So that is the issue down here, right? When you look at the mandate, like say for example, look at the lofty mandate of the UN, right? So broad. How do you think about maintenance of world peace and security? How do you subsequently define that? So then it becomes like everything under the sun that can be defined as world peace and security falls under the purview or the jurisdiction of the IO. And then you have, IOs, like say for example, IOs relating to things like international human rights and humanity, crimes against humanity, like International Criminal Court or the ICTR. And the logic here, right, is really when you look at these IOs and what they're attempting to protect, is it really the responsibility of the international community and an international organization to protect its citizens, to protect citizens of a state? Isn't that the responsibility of the domestic state and the domestic government itself? Same thing to do with economic development, right? And sound economic management. How is it that you end up spending so much money where you cannot provide public goods and services to your citizens, and that you require a loan from an international organization like the IMF, or you require loans for structural development because you are unable to finance it yourself? Who is responsible for these domestic developments? So you turn around and you will say that IOs are not useful, right? And that they stray beyond their original mandate. They engage in mission creep. They take up so much of the funding and budget. They include more and more states and so on. But the logic is that they've become integral even in the domestic affairs of the states, right? So it goes back to this question: who is responsible? And then the states turn around and point a finger at IOs and say they are not using their funding effectively. What about you as a state itself? Are you using your funding effectively? Are you using taxation effectively? Are your political parties and your government functioning effectively? Right? So this is why you notice I always end up, emphasizing the logic about the softer, kinder, gentler view of the IO. It is more really about this idea, right? About why it becomes important to look at it not just only from a cynical view. Some students, they're very cynical, or they take this very harsh negative view of IOs because they point out, that they're ineffective, they're ineffective. Yeah, correct. They're ineffective. Why are they ineffective? Whose fault is it that they're ineffective? Is it entirely their own fault? Or is it, are the states who claim that they're ineffective also have a huge role to play in the IO itself being ineffective, right? And that largely stems or that largely we can understand, right? When we start looking at the mandate and we start looking at the great powers that motivated the establishment, it starts from there, right? But it goes further than that, but it basically starts from there. Then what you also want to be able to explain is the evolution of the IOs and how does the IO change as it evolves, right? Not all IOs basically are evolutions. Say like, for example, okay, wait, sorry. Yes, Pinyang, we need to emphasize the effectiveness of IOs in what perspectives? Yeah, correct. That means there are different ways to understand. Don't just don't just write the IO is ineffective. Why is it ineffective as a result of whose actions? Um, as a result of the time period, it is ineffective. That means wrong place, wrong time. As a result of time period is ineffective, meaning that there are external their external event their external events like economic crisis, for example, or the pandemic that affect the effectiveness of the IO. The external events, say like for example, a resurgent China or a resurgent Russia, that affect effectiveness of the IO, right? Or there are external issues such as, say, for example, considerations that particular members of the P5 have, right? When they want to make a decision. You understand? So this is where you want to calibrate and adjust your response, not just to blanket say IOs are ineffective, which is what I see a lot of students do, right? This batch, not so much. But the past batches, I had one or two batches where I had a group, some students who were like really very, like from the outset of the essay already, you can tell that this response is basically going to trash the IO. And you don't want to trash the IO just arbitrarily. You want to think about it in a more nuanced manner, right? Okay, Piyang, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Then, sorry. So when I was talking about the evolution of IOs, not every chapter is about evolution, right? So, say for example, IMF and World Bank, they're not evolutions of like IMF to World Bank, right? But they are evolutions of the IO over the years. That means how did IMF start off? How did World Bank start off? And what do they look like today? That is one set of evolution. The other set of evolution is the different chapters of the IO. So League of Nations to UN, get to WTO, and so on, right? And what you want to emphasize when you talk about the evolution of the IOs is basically to highlight really that why was there a turning point? That means what was the breaking point or the turning point where they decided that they needed to change things and they needed to institutionalize the IO better to give it more power, to make adjustments to its reach, to basically be able to address newer versions of the problems, right, in international society, right? Or, particularly if you look at, say, for example, GET to WTO, this is one of the most significant changes because basically what you see is GET being simply a treaty or conference and WTO being an international organization. Then that is really, a true change that occurs, right? and Get was not equipped to make any of the decisions or carry out sorry carry out any of the functions or the duties that it was actually supposed to, right? And it was just shouldering this burden of the stillborn ITO, right? And despite shouldering the burden of the stillborn ITO, it managed to do as much as it did, right? So that was, the emphasis of the evolution. That was one of the real admirable IOs, right? So looking at the evolution also, then it would calibrate your response in terms of the effectiveness and so on, right? Then of course you also need to mention, how it functions. So for some of these IOs in particular, the functioning, as in how does it work, right? It's very boring, I know, of for all the chapters, but in some of it is actually important because it shows you who the power centers of the IOs of the IO basically is, who makes the decision, and examining who makes the decision then gives us the ability to explain why things are going correctly or why things are going wrongly. So institutionalization of the different sub-organs, right? How much power they have, how autonomous they are, and so on. And the logic of how often do they meet suggests also who is making the decisions and how frequently they are addressing international issues, right? And also how it functions basically allows us to understand who has the loudest voices in the IO. And understanding who has the loudest voices in the IO then allows us to understand how they are subservient to state or great power interests, right? So if, say, for example, only states with sound economies have the loudest voices, then that tells us in whose favor, which direction, right, the IO is going to be functioning in, traveling in. And that is important. Why? Because that would then help us understand, is it really true, like remember what Mearsheimer said, or what the Marxists say about IOs, that they are merely vehicles for great power interest, right? So if great powers are the ones who have got the loudest voices, right, then obviously the IO will be functioning in a way that their interests are being met. So is that an IO that basically is truly international in that sense, right? Okay. So that is why we are also looking at, whether it's subservient to state or great power interest, because we're looking at who has got the significant power within the IO, who's got the loudest voices. The effects of the IO, basically what we want to look at is what issue areas does it have the biggest impact in. So security, trade, human development, and so on. Okay. And you also want to look at issues relating to who does it affect, right? So does this IO have the same kind of effect on developing countries or developed countries? Does it have a particular focus or interest in, say, for example, African states, like how the African states have accused the ICC of being an African criminal court, right? Does the IO have an effect on people, right? Say, for example, ICC. Hold on, sorry, drink water. ICC, right, has got basically a direct effect on citizens, right, into citizens of the state into which the ICC opens up an investigation into, right? So that's the logic now here. EU basically has got an impact on citizens because of the direct effect. Like remember the Vengen in Luz and the Costa versus the electricity company, right? So what who basically does it affect, or does it affect only states and state leaders? And then also lastly, you want to look at whether the effects are positive or negative, meaning does the has the IO functioned in a counterproductive manner, right? And has it basically defeated its purpose? Like, basically you would say the UN, being unable, okay, actually, unable is the wrong word, being unwilling to stop the Rwandan genocide. That is basically one of the biggest failures of the UN. That's what you're there for, right? And you had information, you had live updates, and you basically, all you needed to do was just step up and define the genocide as a genocide and take action. But basically, they were unwilling and therefore unable to stop the Rwandan genocide, which was a totally unnecessary occurrence in history, in world history. Same thing, right? In the case of, say, for example, the ICC chaining its own hands by allowing the Rome Statute and the principle of complementarity to take effect. And what did that do, basically, at the end of the day? It allows criminals like Omar al-Bashir to run freely at this point, right? Not run free, not run free yet, but run freely, right? Even though he has got 2 arrest warrants on his head. Why? Because if they had made the ICC more powerful, they would have been able to nab him by now, right? Or at least made more progress in nabbing him, right? Right now, the ball is in the court of Sudan, who says, yeah, okay, fine. After 10 years, we've decided that the right thing to do is to hand him over. And we will hand him over, but nothing concrete relating to handing him over has actually been done, right? So, in that sense, do we say that the ICC has acted in a self-defeating manner, right? So, there are different examples that we can use. Say, for example, if you look at IMF and World Bank, and you look at the problems associated with the structural adjustment programs, and the accusations have been piling in, and states have been saying, "I do not want your loan anymore." Right? I reject your loan. And the ICC, the IMF and the World Bank, they are clearly well aware of the problems, right, that their structural adjustment program have caused. And you even have a scenario where the World Bank went as far as to admit and to say, "Yeah, we realize that the problems associated with the structure adjustment programs, and therefore we're going to basically have a review, and then we are going to change the way the programs function." And then they go right round and they have cosmetic changes, nothing much, basically changes with the way the IMF continues to give out loans, and that basically basically allows the problem to continue. So in this case, has the IO defeated its purpose? It knows full well how negative how the negative impact of the loans are affecting citizens, doubly disadvantaged. The disadvantaged by the economic mismanagement of their own domestic elites, and then the disadvantaged by the disadvantages and the problems associated with the structural adjustment programs that only bring about more poverty in some of these states, negative effects on growth, and so on, right? So the effects of the IO, are they positive or are they negative? And then also what you also want to talk about when you talk about the effects, right, is that like what I highlighted, has the IO realized what the effects are? Have they made any kind of impact on the way they are calibrating their response subsequently? That means, have any changes occurred in terms of the IO? Do they acknowledge their failures and then subsequently want to address these failures and make changes or not? Okay, so is the IO forward looking? Okay, then of course we're looking at the theories. This one I explained already. So realism and constructivism really are the two most commonly used theories by students, right, to assess the effects of the IOs. uh, Actually, realism is the one that is the most common. Okay, all right. And then what you also want to okay, this one is wait, I finished that. Let me finish everything else, then I'll come to the last slide. So really it's about which are the theories that most clearly explain the effect of the IOs. One is the most common. Two is which one is the most accurate. Okay. All right. So that's how basically you look at it. Okay. I'm going to go into the discussion about the IOs per se. First few slides I'm not going to do. When you talk about the theories and all, right? I think this one you can read by yourself, right? I want to go specifically into this part here, the actors, forums, and devices. Okay. All right. Before I start this section, I'm going to go through quite fairly quickly because the examples all I'm not going to run through. The examples are there for you to read, right? Or the examples are there to remind you of which parts to look at. So I'm not going to go through the examples per se. I'm just going to run through the important points on each of the slides. Okay. Before I start this, does anyone have any questions to ask? Anybody? Anything to ask? Please ask now, if possible. Not admin stuff, because admin stuff I cannot answer you at this point. Anybody else? Apart from Chinda? All okay? All good, huh? Sure? Okay. I just want to point out one thing before we start this part here. All right. I noticed this trend with some students in this class, actually across the board, all the IR students, even in my year 1 class and my foundation also. Please do not try to engage in reductionist arguments. And sometimes what happens is that you try to make sense of things, right? And then you try to reduce it to a dichotomy. It's either this or that. So does it mean it's like this? Does it mean it's like that? And then you reduce the argument. Try to simplify, oversimplify. Please be very careful about oversimplifying, because I noticed that this is something a lot of students are doing, because I think what has happened is that students have become very conscious about how much they want to write. Am I right? Right. You all are very conscious about how much you all want to include because of the word limit. So when you become conscious of what you want to include in your word limit, you start to think of ways to summarize. Summarizing is one thing, but simplifying is another thing. When you summarize, basically you are reducing verbose language. You are including several points into one sentence. You're looking at examples and so on. That is what summarizing. You're looking at examples briefly, right? That's what summarizing is about. Simplifying is about trying to take away the important details and just simply explaining things in a very simplified rubric, meaning like you're just trying to, like if there are 5 points related to the argument, right? You're trying to squeeze all those 5 points and find something that is common among the 5 points and turn it into something that is just like 1 point. That is the main problem I see with the way students are writing their answers. Or they're looking at it in very black and white ways. It's either this or that. So it means it's like either this or that, either positive or negative. But if you notice the way I explained things to you all just now and throughout the entire course, right, is that things are far more than just positive or negative, right? There are nuances, like what Pingyang asked just now. So you really need to ensure that you do not oversimplify your arguments, thinking that you're actually summarizing. Some students are thinking that they're summarizing it and they're writing in a briefer manner, but what you're actually doing is you're taking away all the important details and the important nuances, and you're sacrificing them, and you're coming up with a very simplistic reductionist theory, right? It's like Casey, for example. Let me give you a very layman example that will help to clarify this. It's like you look at OAU and AU, and you say that states are very protective of their sovereignty. And as a result of states being protective of their sovereignty, the OAU and AU have not made any progress because states are unwilling to cooperate. That is a simplified argument. States, it's not a case where states are not willing to cooperate on all levels. It's not a case where they've not acknowledged the shortcomings. In fact, the AU's charter was an improvement over the OAU. The AU's charter basically understood the problem associated with protecting sovereignty. And the AU basically understood the issue of how states were very inward looking. And this is going to impact on the uh, progress of the entire region. So by reducing it to say the OAU is ineffective, the AU is ineffective because states are protective of their sovereignty. It's ineffective in certain areas. It is ineffective, yes, they are protective of their sovereignty. What are the problems that have been caused? But is it a blanket ineffectiveness? Right? So that is something that students need to explain. You can't just say, oh, it's ineffective because of sovereignty. It's reductionist, right? That is just basically saying sovereignty is the main cause of everything, and then not look at any other aspect. You understand? You understand what I mean by oversimplifying the argument? So you're missing out on vital discussions, right? By just reducing it down to that one factor. It's not about one factor. If it was one factor, right, we would have finished this course in like a couple of weeks. If it was one factor, I would finish the discussion every week at 2 o'clock and not at 3 o'clock, right? Because there's nothing much to discuss, right? Okay, so you understand? Okay, all right, let me run through this material here. All okay, yeah? You understand what I mean by simplifying and why I do not want you all to do it? Everybody understand? All okay? Okay, yeah? All right, okay. So now let's look at the idea of actors, right? All goof. Don't goof up. See, yeah, I sick also still can make name joke, right? Hey, okay, wait, before I forget, one very important thing I want, sorry, that was my email. One very important thing I want to remind you all, uh, because of, the prelim exams, right? Okay. Please go for the prelim exams. I mentioned this to you all before, but I want to reiterate. Please go for the prelim exams. You're highly encouraged to do so, because it gives you an idea of how that final exam is going to look like. But I think very importantly, I want to emphasize this. I told this to my year one classes, and if you have been in my class before, I think you would have heard me say this, but I want to emphasize it again. Please do not burn out during or before the prelims. Study for the prelims, attempt the questions, right? Treat it like how you would the final exam. But don't overstress yourself and look at the prelim paper and say, I cannot answer this, I cannot answer that, I am a failure, or I cannot do this, or I don't have time. The prelim paper is like a test run, right? So logic here is this. If you feel during the prelims that, I mean, you see the paper, right? If you feel extremely stressed and you feel that you cannot answer the questions, take it as a matter of fact that these are the things that you need to therefore work on, rather than to beat yourself up, or rather than to say, I can't do this and therefore, I'm not going to do well in my final exam. There are a lot of students who did not do well for prelims, or who did not complete the entire paper, but who did relatively well for the final exam, right? So the prelims is just like a practice session, okay? So if you didn't get the grade that you wanted, don't obsess over it. Meaning, don't, kill yourself over it, right? It's basically, uh, just tell yourself, okay, that I will work on these particular areas. What you do not know, right? That means if you feel you cannot answer, That means that's just an indicator of what you need to work on. That is how you need to approach it. If you're going to look at it in any other way, right, it is going to affect your self confidence. It's going to also affect the way you approach revision subsequently, right? Okay, so this is my one piece of advice to you. You are lucky in the sense that when I was in university, I didn't have prelim exams. It was unheard of. We just, did the course and then went straight to the exam. So we didn't have a test run, right? So I think that use the opportunity to your advantage, right? To have a test run, right, as to how the exams are going to look like. Also, I would like to say one more thing, right? In general, for IO in particular, for this course in particular, maybe not so much for other courses, but for the prelim papers, I do notice that in some years, right, the prelim questions are actually very different from the final exam questions. So that means the prelim exam questions is not an accurate gauge of how the final exam paper is going to look like. Okay, so that is another indicator. I remember, I think the first year or second year that I taught this course, the half the prelim paper out of the 12 questions, right? Half the prelim paper, about 5 to 6 questions, were all in the UN. I got a shock. I got a shock looking at the paper. I was like, why is it like this? Yeah. And of course, the final exam wasn't like that, lah, right? Okay. But so you got to take it with a pinch of salt. All right. It's not a direct indicator of what the final exam is going to look like. So don't be complacent, right? Thinking that, oh, this is the standard of the final exam. um, with the COVID and the way assessment changed, and then now back to closed book again, I really cannot. I'm sorry, but I really cannot gauge. And I think I've mentioned this before. UL doesn't communicate with us on the exam paper per se. We have ever tried. I've tried. Like during some of the UK revisions in the past. When we have the UK revisions and the UK lecturers come down, and then we are tasked to go and have lunch with them. So sometimes we like to ask, like, so how do you think the trend in the exam paper is going to look like? They're very tight-lipped. They won't say anything to us, and then they don't communicate with us otherwise also. So I don't have any insider information on the exam paper, so I'm sorry. I'm not bluffing you, like it's just really true, right? Okay, so I don't have insider information, so just do lah. Okay, just do your best. Okay, all right, that's my piece of advice to you. Okay, I'm going to run through the material here now. Okay, so how to assess role of IOs as actors, right? Looking at their independent action. That's basically the idea that you want to contrast with what Mearsheimer mentioned, that IOs are epiphenomenal. IOs are not epiphenomenal, right? It's not a case where they they do not simply only reflect existing power relationships in global politics. It's not a case where they have no effect, right? And the case is really the idea that IOs, when they do not have power, it is because they do not always have the right or the authority to act independently from the states, right? But and you notice that this changes according to time period. It changes according to the IO that is being examined as well. So if and when states do comply with the terms of international treaties, why do the states decide to comply? It's simply because they realize that there's an absolute gain to be had, right? So by participating in the IO, I'm going to be part of an alliance, and this alliance is going to be useful to the furtherance of my interests, let's say, because it is going to contribute to increasing my power, increasing my security, or it cements my position as a significant actor in international relations. Like, how China is now attempting to play a larger role in um, global politics, right? Especially after it realized that the US under Trump had retreated away from the global role, quite different from Clinton's period, where he put the US more on the global platform and wanted to participate very actively in global governance, right? Okay, so that is when IOs become relevant to states. IOs also become relevant to states when they feel that okay, I do not need to change my behavior much in order to be part of the IO. So I can continue to function the way that I function, and I can reap whatever benefits I can reap. Okay, when you look at instances, I mean, so that the first slide is basically the idea of how IOs do live up to their name of being epiphenomenal in some sense, but the social constructivist perspective, basically functions as a counterfoil, or a, like an argument that debunks that myth about how IOs are epiphenomenal. So it highlights how states highlights how IOs, right, function as autonomous actors in world politics, right? And this debunks what realists say about IOs. So the role that they play, the amount of influence they wield, right, IOs becoming more and more independent, right, is increasing because they are able to exercise their authority. They're able to lay down rules. They are able to perpetuate norms, and they're able to socialize states into abiding by these norms and so on. Okay, so that is basically the idea of how we understand IOs being able to act independently. Okay, and what you also want to discuss is that um, looking at it via themes. If you look at all these pink highlights that I have in the lecture notes, right? They are basically themes. Okay, so the idea of okay, look at IOs in terms of contribution to policy making, or how their policy making behavior looks like, right? So the idea is that okay, say for example, when you look at the logic of IOs being successful in formulating, implementing policies, regarding things like universal challenges that states cannot address by themselves, like what HIV, AIDS, poverty, development, environment, right? Okay, states find it difficult to respond to these issues, or in some cases, states do not want to commit to responding to these issues because they are thinking about other issues on the agenda that they have to deal with. So the rationale is that they rather devote their time, funding, effort to these other issues of great or what they deem to be greater importance, such as economic development and economic growth and so on. So this is where basically you get issues relating to why states are uncompromising, or why states do not cooperate enough. Okay, the idea also is that IOs, by way of doing this, they have actually affected the interests of states in areas like healthcare, electoral processes, domestic issues, like what we see the OSCE. OSCE basically helped to play a large role, right, in helping to establish law and order institutions, in helping to oversee election commissions in newly democratizing states, capacity building in terms of elections and democratic institutions in newly democratic states in Eastern Europe, right? So the logic is that the IOs then, now we understand them to become more pervasive. They can make decisions that reach, every citizen. They can affect things like governmental spending. They can affect things like how states approach maternal health, which is associated with reproductive rights, how they approach addressing poverty, how IOs today have played a big role in pointing out states' shortcomings in addressing poverty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and so on, right? So, if you look at a lot of IOs, ranging from IMF to World Bank, NATO, uh, OSCE, UN, WTO, all of them have made comments, have made statements relating to development uh, in the and moving towards a post-COVID-19 era. I mean, it's talking about recovery, right? And what the roles of states basically should be about. Okay, all right. Then you look at national administrations, right? So this one, of course, important. This one, if you want to discuss, you must have examples, right? Like what I've given you: interim admission administration missions in Kosovo, missions to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on, right? So they are able to, assist states by taking active interest in taking part in how states function domestically, especially when states are undergoing long periods of instability as a result of emerging from crisis. Okay, wait, hold on, drink water. Okay, and then they also are able to play active roles on political institutional landscapes, right? By imposing sanctions and by reminding states that these are the norms that they should follow, right? These are how they should transform the economies in order to be an effective member of the international system, how they should reform their financial system, how they should relook the way they approach political institutional landscapes, like how do they look at human rights, how are they looking at implementation, like say for example the elections commissions, right? That is to do with strengthening democracy, strengthening domestic elites, accountability to citizens, and so on. Okay, so the rationale, is that you need to have a balanced argument to highlight that these kinds of activities, of course, they are in state's interest. Like, of course, it's in the state's interest to ensure that its elections commission is something that is uh, able to function independently and in line with global understandings of what an elections commission should look like. But at the same time, it also represents IO's interests, right? Because IOs are basically microcosm of international society, and they're the norm entrepreneurs. So the IOs basically function as agents of change and socialization, right? Then when you look at, the idea of normative origin, I forgot to highlight this in pink. Sorry, I missed this one out. So normative origin, right? This one we've discussed many times before, right? So the idea here is you go according to, I mean, if you discuss this point, you should include how Barnett and Fenimore are, the ones that you attribute this idea to, right? IOs, they are able to use all of these rules of membership and rules of behavior not only to perform this reiterating function, right, of reminding states what rules of membership and rules of behavior are, but it's about regulation of state behavior, but it is also part of the interests of the IOs because that is forms the identity of the IOs, right? So the rationale is that IOs become autonomous sites of authority. Their bureaucracies, now are seen to possess authority and control, right? So the logic here is that the role and the staff of IOs who translate broad mandates into actionables, right? IOS as bureaucracy basically enables us to look at them as independent actors, right, in their own right. And basically, when you look at, the logic of IOs becoming more influential, when they're more influential, they have more authority, they have more autonomy. The higher the authority, the higher the autonomy, right? So, the logic about looking at examples that reflect this authority and reflect states' fear of this authority. The Rome Statute of the ICC. States wanting to exit from the ICC. States wanting to exit from the EU. Basically, this, is seen, one is seen as, some people will see as a failure of the IO. But flip it around on its head. If the IO is not powerful and it doesn't have authority, it doesn't have autonomy, why do states want to dumb down its effectiveness by taking away key elements like the Rome Statute in the ICC, right? If it wasn't so powerful and if it didn't represent a strengthening or it didn't represent, a key element of the international judicial system, why would states actively try to make it less powerful, right? Why would they want to curtail its powers? So that's the idea that you want to emphasize. So that indirectly tells us that if you give the if you give the IO the authority, they are going to be autonomous, they're going to wield this power, and they're going to be able to tell errant states, right, that what they're doing is wrong. And therefore, their level of influence domestically is going to be much stronger. Okay? All right. This one example, right? OSCE in BIH, right? Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? So just basically these are examples or illustrations of what I mentioned to you earlier on. I'm not going to run through this for you to read. Okay. All right. Moving on. IOs as forums, right? This one is a very standard argument, from year one, basic IR. We've already established, this idea that when you look at liberalism, right, IOs basically function as platforms, right, sites of interaction, forums, right, by which IOs can function. So that is the discussion that you want to emphasize on here, right? That the IOs, they are sometimes unable to bring about international outcomes, right, as independent actors because of the obstacles that states basically place in front of them. And even if that's the case, right, what can happen and what allows them to remain important or remain relevant, right, is the logic of them functioning as platforms, platforms of interaction, forums, right? So it is the site, SITE, right, wherein actors, international actors, can engage in bargaining, can engage in interaction with each other, can engage in negotiations, right? So the logic is that if you look at the prisoner's dilemma, why does, do you remember the prisoner's dilemma? You know what the prisoner's dilemma is, right? Okay. Why is it that the prisoner's dilemma always resulted in an outcome that was assumed to be individually beneficial but collectively detrimental? Right? The prisoner's dilemma always shows that individually actors who are in the separate cells, who do not communicate with one another, they are trying to create an outcome that they feel is the best, minimizing their losses, right? And they're creating an outcome that they think is the best for them. But when you look at it as a whole, right, collectively, whatever outcomes have been created are actually more negative at the end of the day. So collectively, it's counterproductive. So what using that as the basis for understanding the logic here is that why that happens is because they don't interact with one another in the prisoner's dilemma. They don't have information about what the other actor is going to do. So a lack of interaction, a lack of information results in suspicion. It results in an inability to make decisions that are going to be collectively beneficial. So IOs help to minimize this issue because if they're a site or a forum, you can have repeated engagement, repeated interaction. You help to reduce, in a true liberalist sense, you help to reduce the level of uncertainty. So therefore, cooperation becomes possible and sustainable. Very importantly, this all occurs in an anarchic international system where there's no one supreme leader to help to regulate these interactions. So states must take it upon themselves, right, and use these international organizations as sites, avenues for discussion, right? And the logic is that repeated interaction, right, and contributes to socialization, right? So and persuasion. So that is basically the idea. Repeated interactions, allow the states to use the IOs as a platform by which they can socialize themselves into adopting norms, right? Exchanges that influence the way they respond to others, right? Because remember, where when we talk about social constructivism, right, we say that, oh, the states are looking at whether there are opportunities to cooperate or whether the environment is very hostile. All of this occurs where? What is this environment we're talking about? The international political system is an abstract idea. There's no, like, they don't all go to like a space station, right? And sorry, I couldn't help myself. They- it- it's not like a physical, place in the universe, right? They all go to a particular country where the conference is being held or where the IO is headquartered, and they interact, right? So that is the platform, okay? And that is where they realize, the importance of partaking in such exchanges, right? Also, I use the OSCE as an example, right, of forum, right? OSCE, very important in highlighting the issue of states as as IOs, having being functioning as like a neutral platform, right? Because the idea is that in the OSCE, all the states, member states, right, there is no such thing as a more powerful or a larger state having a greater voice. All of them have got equal participatory rights, right? So a lack of a very rigid structure then allows the OSCE to respond quickly, right? Respond flexibly. Of course, the absence of a rigid legal structure also prevents the OSCE from responding like how NATO would respond. How NATO would respond. But each of these have value in different scenarios, in different situations, right? So we can't say that having a rigid legal structure is very good, or having a rigid legal structure is very bad, or having a lack of rigid legal structure is good or bad, right? We can't come to this very black and white argument because, like what I said, it depends on the scenario. Okay, all right. Moving to credible commitment devices, right? So when you look at the logic of devices, right? Basically, you're looking at the idea is that the IOs allow states to signal to their domestic population, right? That okay, this is the interests of our state. This is what we're committed to, right? So basically, it allows states to elicit commitment to particular institutions, also on on an international level. On a domestic level, remember, like how we looked at WTO and how in 2014 in particular, India was negotiating the issue of agriculture, and what did it do? It used the IO to signal a commitment to the farmers domestically, saying that they're not going to sell them out on the global stage, right? So, it signals a commitment to particular institutions. In the case of India, that was a negative, outcome, because at the end of the day, India's demands, function as a stumbling block to the effective resolution of the negotiations, right? But I mean, you understand it, from that perspective, right? And it also, enables, democratic leaders to signal their commitment to particular principles, like, say, for example, being part of the EU, all right? What does that signal to themselves, to their citizens, to other states? That they are committed to, uh, say, for example, they're committed to trade liberalization. They're committed to ensuring that they are reducing barriers to entry. They're committed to ensuring the free movement of people, goods, labor, and capital. That's exactly what Britain didn't want, and now is experiencing the fallout, right? But the and that is also another example. It signals to states what will happen if you do not abide by, or you do not stick by these preferences and so on. Okay, all right. And also when we say commitment devices, right, just go back to the basic idea of what is the idea of sanctions. Sanctions basically perform two functions, and sanctions are usually levied by the international organization on states, right? They not only tell states offending, they not only tell offending states what is right and what is wrong, it reiterates to the rest of the states who are not offenders, right, that these are the rules of membership and rules of behavior. It reminds them, right, that should you contravene any of this, this is how it is going to be dealt with. Okay. And it also sends a strong signal to offending states that transgressions, of international law are not going to be uh, just, you're not going to let it slide, right? That they will be severely dealt with in an official manner. Okay. All right. All right. So this one, we've looked at this before, right? And I like this example particularly. Just give me 2 minutes to explain this. I like this example particularly because there are different arguments that you can use to justify states. Sorry, different arguments that you can use to explain how states actually justify structure adjustment programs. They know, the damages that structure adjustment programs can, bring about. But, there are different rationales or reasons why they may continue to do so, right? So you've got the scapegoat story, you've got the signaling story, and the tipping the balance story. Like tipping the balance is the one that they understand that they can use the IMF to basically as an excuse, right, to push through unpopular policies. That means if they push through an unpopular policy domestically, citizens will be very unhappy, and they may suffer at the hands of the voters in the next election. And if you don't want to suffer at the hands of the voters in the next election, basically what you do is you push through an unpopular policy that is going to be beneficial to the state. But you push it through in such a way where you basically uh, use, the IMF as an excuse to say that, it was the outside pressure of the IMF is the one that prompted me to do so, and so on, right? So that is the rationale. The scapegoat story is, different. The logic about uh, economic mismanagement. Economic mismanagement, why we are facing the problems that we're facing is largely because, of the problems associated with the structure adjustment programs. So both is placing blame on the IMF, right? But for different reasons. Okay. All right. Democratization, right, is another one, right? So when states want to transform their domestic structures, basically they can look towards the international organization as a justification as to why they want to transform their domestic structures, or it can basically again signify their commitment, right? That means they use their accession to international organizations like EU, for instance, to basically say that okay, we're going to start the democratization process, and regardless of whether it's my political party or another government that comes into power, we're going to see through this project because we've already signed the treaty and we're part of the EU now, and therefore we need to commit to democratic reform and so on, right? Okay, so this is another example that you can use. All right. So basically, you're looking at IOs, right, also being able to function as a legitimizing force, right? So the idea here is that they want to legitimize their behavior, or they want to legitimize their action. Like say, for example, coercing states like the US, right? They will basically use the UN Security Council and their veto in the UN Security Council to basically put forth a particular position on an issue, or put forth a particular, like further their agenda, right? And highlight, they use the UN Security Council as like a megaphone, right, to transmit information to other states, basically to say that okay, this is our take on this particular scenario, say like a particular conflict, we don't want to get involved or we want to get involved, why we want to get involved, why we are vetoing, and so on. So they're using it as a way to legitimize their domestic agenda. Okay, all right. Then we also use it as we also understand iOS as a screening device, right? Okay, so the other way to look at it is that the IO, like say for example IMF or World Bank or any other international organization that comes up with say reports, right, that rank states and so on, like the doing business report that basically allows investors and other states to assess the credit worthiness and commitment of states to economic reform. So it allows a creditor or investor to see how these debtor countries have been functioning. It allows NGOs or it allows citizens, right? Say for example, go to UN website or go to ICC website or any one of these websites that have got reports on individual countries. It allows individuals uh, you know to also take a look at the progress of states, right? In what areas have states failed, in what areas have states made progress, how they compare against each other, even because it's often a ranking, right? So that is also how we identify the idea of screening device. Okay, notice all of these phrases, right? Okay, they are basically looking at themes: screening device, forum, actor, credible commitment device, and so on. They're all themes that you can use. Okay. Okay. So empirical observations, right? This is basically, a lot of the discussion that we've looked at here uh, have, been discussed in several of the individual IOs. So I'm going to run through fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through every single slide, right? But what you want, and what I've already summarized for you in, the beginning part of this lecture, right? So basically the hot button issues, right? Economic affairs, HR, human rights, environmental concerns, right? These are international issues, and these are more susceptible to influence of IOs as opposed to uh, issues that are tied to domestic concerns like security, conflict, war, anything to do with domestic concerns relating to power, relating to security, right? So of course, there are a lot of comparisons across IOs, but sometimes it's difficult to make comparisons because empirically, you know, how do you how do you gather enough information? So, there are very few studies that actually look at the effectiveness of IOs, which is what we've actually attempted to do, right? So, the next couple of slides basically highlight to you how, the different IOs, right, have fared in terms of human rights and how they fared in terms of, environmental concerns and so on. So basically, what we're looking at is here the contributions of IOs to these different issue areas. Obviously, you have got the war crime tribunals. You've got ICC. You've got the European Court of Human Rights. You've got the EU 2000 Charter of Fundamental Rights, and so on. Right. So you really have to look at it in a case by case analysis, right? The individual contributions that they've made. Okay. And then if you look at environment, there's really no one specific IO that has dealt with environmental issues, right? There are very few IOs, and we certainly do not examine any IOs, that are wholly dedicated to environmental issues. But often we look at how each of these IOs have got departments or have got structures within them, right, that address environmental issues, right? So you've got the UNEP, you've got the European Environment Agency that comes under the auspices of the EU and so on. But what you want to highlight is this how environmental concerns, right, come under the logic of human security, new security, right? And international resolution of environmental concerns has been very difficult because environment is considered as a public good. Therefore, you have issues relating to free rider, you have issues relating to the tragedy of the commons, right? And of course, if given a choice, states are more willing to address issues relating to economics and politics and security and defense, because this is what is considered to be high politics. Environmental issues have always been swept under the carpet and have been considered as low politics. This has taken a slight change, in the last 2 decades or so, with the rise of green parties domestically, with the rise of domestic agenda, with the rise of environmental issues on the domestic agenda, with the rise of environmental issues in terms of awareness among citizens and so on. So, the logic is that, main question that I want to ask is that things like the Kyoto Protocol or the COP26, Paris Climate Accords, would they basically see more success? It's just a question. Would they basically see more success if it was enforced by an IO instead of just remaining as an environmental regime? Or does the nature of environmental issues is so great that whether it is an IO or whether it's an environmental regime, is still going to face the problems that it faces? It's just a inquisitive question, right? That I wanted to ask and get you to think about. Okay, all right. Then you have other issues, say, like what can IOs do, right? Okay, so I'm not going to run through this because we have discussed this many, many, many times, right? Just look at the different themes, right? Basically looking at, development of new ideas related to things like peacekeeping, like responsibility to protect, right? Peacekeeping and all of the issues related to human security, right, as opposed to state security, is really, uh, a result of change in thinking, right, as to what constitutes development. And what constitutes development, this is where we, come to this conclusion where the IO, in this case, the UN, right, the UN's Millennium Development Goals, right, have been fundamental, or R2P has been fundamental. As to how successful they are is a separate issue, right? But it is a development of a new idea, and it's a placing of this idea on high up on the agenda. Okay, I always basically fill knowledge gaps and gather data, right? Like say for example, data collection, translate in, and allowing that to translate into workable agenda items, allowing that to translate into information for states. I always also they allow them to promote and monitor goals, right? Goal setting is very important because states require some kind of regulation, right? It also sets, focus area for NGOs to mobilize action, right? It generates pressure for action and so on. So you notice also that IOs often work with individuals, they work with corporations, they work with NGOs, right? Particularly in the area of human rights. You notice, for certain areas, we are able to make this emphasis. So human rights or human security or things, associated with human development, right? This is where I think IOs tend to play a stronger role and have been and witness a little bit more success in comparison to, say, like for example, hard notions of security and military per se. Okay. Wait, sorry, did I skip the point? Okay, correct. Okay. Agenda setters in the international arena, right? So, what I always identify, say, for example, the UN, right? How they identify particular issues, say, for example, the idea of self determination and decolonization. That is basically provided the impetus, right, in calling attention to apartheid and ensuring that the process of decolonization is completed. Right? Only after the process of decolonization was completed in the African continent, that was when you saw the closure of the trusteeship council in the UN, right? So of course, it's not always successful, right? But at least it is a forum where IOs can help to mobilize global sentiment. You've got vetoes that the UN Security Council and the P5 have, right? Like China, Russia, or US vetoes and so on. But even when they do veto, what does it do? The veto is actually publicized and people get to know about it. Other states express disappointment, right? Or NGOs express disappointment and so on. So that is, the issue of placing, uh, you know, issues of concern higher up on the agenda in the international arena. It draws attention to it. And even if enough attention is drawn over enough a period of time, that means long enough a period of time. Sorry, let me rephrase that. If enough attention is drawn to an issue over long enough a period of time, that's what I wanted to say, right? Then you would realize that sooner or later, this would gain traction on an international level and something can be done about it. Okay? If it doesn't gain traction if it doesn't draw attention and doesn't gain traction at international level, then how are you ever going to address it? How are you ever going to solve a problem? Cannot. IOs also have the ability to adapt and reform. The number one organization you would use as an example would be NATO, right? The evolution beyond its original mandate, despite whatever criticisms it's endured in terms of mission creep, in terms of not being able to address all of these accusations of not staying in its lane, of no longer actually being representative of the North Atlantic and so on. At the end of the day, it expanded its membership. It is now an organization dedicated to defense of its members rather than defense of the North Atlantic, right? So, it's the territorial limitation is basically no longer an issue because the idea is that the Russian threat has never dissipated. All those people who had earlier argued and said that NATO is irrelevant because Russian intransigence went away as a result of the end of the Cold War. Now, would be rethinking their statements because 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea, today current threat to invade Ukraine, all of the transgressions Russia has made in terms of interfering in elections, operating in the gray zone, and so on. All of this, right, basically highlights the Russian threat manifests in a very different way today, and defense against threats that manifest from states, right, who are attempting to reclaim their position in the international arena or global arena, regional arena, right? Or attempting to, whatever, fulfill whatever agenda that they have. Organizations dedicated to collective security, like NATO, are integral. Cannot run away from it, cannot escape from it, right? Where IOs face challenges, right? Okay, we've discussed this many, many times before, right? So I'm not going to run through this part, right? Because basically the ideas and the examples are illustrated for you. So particularly in enforcement, right? The ICC, right? Not being able to arrest, and bring offenders like Bashir, right? Is one very glaring example, right? Quick reaction in a crisis, right? The logic here is that, remember I mentioned to you, IOs basically they're tasked to do a lot of things that states don't want to do, won't do, right? And things that basically they are not equipped to do. They do not have the funding or the capacity to do so. So they're hampered by several of these different issues. Okay, so and also where this becomes very problematic is when you require multilateral interventions or cross agency collaboration, right? It becomes even more complicated. Number two and number three are related to each other, right? Okay, the logic of spaghetti junction, the logic of consolidating activities, who is responsible for what, right? Sometimes it ends up in clashes over institutional turf. Sometimes it's a case of redundancy. That means doing the same thing again and again by different actors, which is basically very ineffective, right? Then you also have a situation where you want to consider not only do the multilateral action, right, affect the way the IOs function, is that the multilateral action among states, right? So all states have got different approaches as to how they want to address issues. Okay, this one, I pulled this out from Kenneth Walt's arguments on superpowers. This is, we've discussed this in a roundabout way, but basically looking at how states wield power, right? So, I would use these arguments, more for conclusions or evaluations, right? Finally, when you want to conclude to say like, okay, what is the role of or contribution of the IOs? Basically looking at the idea of power, right? How states that are more powerful basically have got the ability to play a larger role, and it is in their interest to play a larger role in the international system. The other issue, that you want to think about is there a need for the management of the international system? And I would say yes, right? Because of increased interaction, and this is a often repeated argument, right? Because of increased interaction, because of regulation, I'm sorry, because of increased interaction, you require more regulation. This is the logic of management. States become more interdependent, right? And higher levels of interdependence brings about, friction. It brings about, wariness, suspicion, and so on, right? So, of course, there is obviously a need for management of the international system. You also need, management of the international system, and you need to have IOs there because the international system is basically run by great powers. Are great powers always the great responsibles of the international system? They take responsibility. If great powers are concerned only about amassing power for themselves, then there needs to be an external agency or a neutral party to rein in check, right? Rein in and check, right, the powers of the major players of the system, right? So therefore, you need management. Okay. The logic is that when you look at this point, IOs basically they're a mixed bag, right? They have had fairly checkered history, right, in terms of success, right? And sometimes it is very easy for us to say IOs really reflect the reality of the international order rather than define it. Because at the end of the day, we got to admit, while IOs are important, they are independent, they are also hampered by state action. They can only do as much as the states also allow them to do, or the states are willing to cooperate. So this is where you get, that nuance or that balance that you need to bring about in your arguments, right? To highlight that IOs and states, they are in this mutually dependent relationship. In certain issue areas, states need the IOs. In certain other issue areas, IOs need the states. So you cannot divorce one from another. You cannot say one is more important than another. So that is why we come up with this way to understand it in terms of a fairly checkered history. Okay. All right. And what you want to be able to explain is like, in what periods, right? In what areas do you see the IOs as products of the international system, right? That means in what areas or what periods do you see states basically driving or pushing the IOs in a particular direction? So in some cases, like IOs used as tools, right, by the states to project power, like what you see China, Russia, US in the UN Security Council, right? In other cases, you see the IOs, like what we explained earlier on. The IOs are the ones that are able to push the states, right, in terms of abiding by the norms, in terms of following particular rules and regulations, and so on, right? In terms of defining things like responsibility to protect, or defining what is a refugee, talking about what it means to do good business, talking about what it means to understand the logic of crimes of aggression or crimes against humanity, right? So it works two ways. It's different issue areas, different periods of time. Okay, that's the most important thing you want to understand. All right, and then what are the problems today that require multilateral action, right? I think this is important. We've already discussed this before, right? But it's important to make it clear in your exam, right? Global problems that cannot be solved singly relate to things like poverty, population management, pollution, right? That means environmental issues and proliferation, right? The issue really is that these are going to be issues that are going to confound states for a long period of time, because these I would consider to be wicked problems, right? Okay, wicked. Let me type that out for you. Wicked problems are problems that are not easily solved. They are interrelated to other issues. They are issues that are indicative of other problems. That means, poverty is associated with, say, population boom. Population boom and poverty is associated with environmental degradation. And environmental degradation gets exacerbated as a result of poverty, right? They're all interrelated, right? So that's the issue down here, okay? And, why these cannot be tackled effectively is like, who's going to pay? Who's going to solve it, right? Who's going to pay for solving these issues, right? The states, the IOs, right? So, the rationale is that if, as long as IOs and states cannot identify whose responsibility these are, and as long as states and IOs view each other in an antagonistic way, as long as IOs are seen by states to encroach on their independence and their sovereignty, then these problems cannot be solved, right? Okay, so that's why I said, that it's a scenario where it's a mutual relationship. It is about IOs needing states and states needing IOs. So ultimately, right, in conclusion, it is about shared responses to shared challenges, right? And this is what is fundamental to our understanding today of multilateralism and global governance. Okay, all right. So with that, basically, I have concluded, my summary of the important issues that you need to consider and the important topics, right, that you need to pay attention to for this course. All right. It's 2:57. So I kept my promise. I finished at a decent time. I finished early, 3 minutes before call time. All right. So, like I mentioned, please, make sure that you consider all the issues that I have, discussed. Think about all the questions that I've asked in class. Please make sure, you look at the addendums. We have 2 revision lectures, right? Look at all the media articles and so on, right? Revisit any part of revisit the recordings on Kaltura. I'm not deleting. I've never deleted, and I will not delete any of the recordings, right? Across all the courses, not just IR2085. So please, go and watch it. Watch the videos. I didn't get to watch a lot of videos with y'all this term, right? So, if I've asked y'all to read something, I don't give y'all homework in the sense that I don't insist that y'all go and read this or go and do something, XYZ. But if I ask you to watch a video, if I've linked it, if I ask you to read something, that means it's significant in some way or another, right? I don't unnecessarily give you stuff to read that is irrelevant. So please, take a look at the materials I've asked you to read. If I ask you to keep a tab on things that are developing, like the Ukraine crisis, for example, please keep a tab on it. All right. Think about all the discussions I put forth to you, all the questions that I've asked. Think carefully about the way you want to structure your arguments, and ensure that you do not write biased answers. Sometimes it's very clear. I read the introduction already. It's very clear to me that the student already has got a preconceived notion and is biased. So be careful of this also. All right. Good luck for the prelims. Please, be sensible about your revision. All right. Don't burn out. Don't study IO the whole day for one day, because you're going to end up hating it. Okay. And yeah, I will see you all for the revision lectures. Okay. All right, we've got 2 more lessons to go before you actually take your final exams. All right, so have a good study break, and I will see you for the revision lectures. Okay. Yes, thank you. I will try to get better as soon as possible. All right. Yes, avoid writing a dichotomous answer. I mentioned to you, Ping Yang, right, is to look at it from the various perspectives. Look at it from different perspectives of the perspective of the IO. Look at it from perspective of the state. Look at it from different periods of time, right? Look at it from the different theories, right? So that is the comprehensive and sophisticated way to answer. The dichotomous is when you just start to reduce things, to just two simple arguments. Okay. All right. I will return everybody's, whoever has sent me any of these papers, right? I will get them to you by the end of this week, all right, or by Monday, right? So definitely before your prelims, lah. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody. Yes, I will rest well. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. I will see y'all. Uh, Please stay safe. All right. Don't go and fall sick during exam period. That's the worst thing that can happen. Okay. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everyone. Please make sure that if you have any questions, email me.